welcome to the Family Treehouse, a podcast series brought to you by Storied, where I chat with people that have a passion for genealogy, storytelling, or both. I'm your host, Heather Haunert, and my official role here at Storied is in the marketing department. But I'm also a hardcore genealogist, and I have been digging up my roots for more than 2 decades. Today, I am very excited to chat with our very first guest on the podcast, Megan Hillier of Know Your Ancestors. And if you haven't seen her site or podcast, they are awesome. And I adore her social media. So if you haven't checked it out, I am a hardcore follower of your social. So welcome, Megan. How are you today?
Thank you. I am doing great. Happy to be here.
Good. Well, we are thrilled to have you today. Why don't you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in family history and storytelling?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Megan Hillier. I live in Alberta, Canada, and I just started a new podcast about a month and a half ago, where I interview guests and we research their family tree and then share what we found with them. It's been a lot of fun, and it's kind of a new kind of take on what I have done with my business. So I first started out, my dad has always been interested in family history. As a kid, he would try to assign us to research one family line, which never really led to anything because we had no clue what we were doing as kids. And back then it was way more difficult than it is now to research your family. But there was always just that kind of dialogue in our family about family history, learning about our ancestors and knowing who they are. It was always just an important part of our life. And about 6 years ago, I decided to go back to school to get a degree in family history research from BYU, Idaho. So that was online. I have 7 kids. I was pregnant with my 7th at the time. So it was a lot of work, but I slowly got through it. It took me about 3 or 4 years to finally graduate and be done with that. But as I learned about how to research an ancestor, how to research someone, I quickly felt like I wanted everyone to know how to do this. It was not something that should be hidden or reserved for those who paid to get a degree. Felt like it was important for everyone to learn how to find out more about their family tree. So that's when I started an Instagram account where I shared tips and information about getting started researching your family tree. And it was a little more about like the technical side of it. Specifically with FamilySearch, I really enjoy using FamilySearch because it's free, and there's a lot of good tools on there for people to use. But after a couple of years, I felt kind of a pull to change my direction a bit with what I shared on Instagram and social media. I felt like there's a lot of power in knowing the stories of our ancestors, in knowing who they were and what life was like for them, and how that can affect our own lives and influence, our own situations and where we are now. So that's kind of how I've kind of changed course a bit in the last year. My business was called Modern Genealogy, but I felt like that name doesn't really appeal to many people that aren't interested in genealogy necessarily. So Know Your Ancestors felt like more of kind of the purpose that I wanted to share with people, that as we know our ancestors, we can better connect to them and understand their influence on our own lives.
Yeah, and I love that name. I think it's a perfect name. I really like it. And first off, I'm jealous because I wish when I'm way older than you are. And I wish there was like some kind of degree when I was, young and couldn't get into that because it wasn't really an option. And I just have to say too, that on your site, I was so moved, like it brought me to tears when I read the quote that's at the bottom of your page. Henry B. Eyring said, "You're not just gathering names. Those you never met in life will become friends you love. Your heart will be bound to theirs forever." And I think that's so true with family history and just I think you almost get to know those people, and even though they're not alive anymore, I just like I
Mhm.
feel like there are certain ones that I'm just part of when I'm
Mhm.
telling their stories.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So why do you think the storytelling part is so important to family history in general?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So my brother is also really into family history, and his kind of his goal is like to make our tree as big and as far back as
Yeah.
possible, find as many new people, which I think is great. But for me, I feel like the stories are where, I don't know, that's how I feel more connected to my ancestors, when I learn about their story. And really, like, a lot of them don't have stories necessarily. Like, they might not have a journal or a memoir written about them or stories written about them, but we can learn their story through lots of different ways. But I feel like it's an important part just because that's how we connect to them. Like, that's just with even our friends and family now that are here. That's how we connect, right? By knowing people's stories. And it's just the same with our ancestors. As we know their stories, we can connect. We can feel, that connection with them. So I feel like it's a huge part of family history that I think often gets overlooked.
Yes. Do you think it's because people are nervous to write, do you think, or is there some other reason, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think it feels daunting to gather all of those details about an ancestor's life, right? And to try to make it into some cohesive story. And that is daunting. Like, that's a lot to do. But I don't think we need to do it like that. Like, we don't have to have this complete story of an ancestor's life. We can just find little bits and pieces as we go.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the little bits and pieces are key. I think so many
Mhm.
people get hung up on you have to tell a 400-page,
Mhm.
biography of a person, and it can be just short little snippets. That's what we
Mhm.
remember, those
Mhm.
short little snippets of stories.
Right.
Um, how do you go about writing a story? Like, when you decide there's a story you want to write, is there a process that you use when you write a story?
Yeah. So right now, I don't really write involved or really long stories, but I can call them still stories as I'm learning about an ancestor. So I guess when I approach that in that aspect about learning about an ancestor, how I write their story, I would first look at kind of those life events that happened, um, those pivotal moments. Maybe they immigrated somewhere, maybe when they got married, had children, if they served in the war, kind of those unique life events that happened. And then you kind of go a little deeper. Okay, so if they immigrated, why? Why did they leave Ireland to come to Canada? What was the driving force? So maybe you need to learn some history of the area, and that can add a little more detail to that story now, right? So now they escaped the potato famine to leave Ireland, so now you understand a bit of their circumstance. So just adding those little details in as you look at records, as you look at history, historical context, that can kind of help add more into our stories of our ancestors.
Yeah. Do you have any resources or tools that you recommend for somebody as they're starting out researching or writing their family stories that you use that you particularly like to use?
Yeah. Yeah. So FamilySearch has a really great website called the FamilySearch Research Wiki. And it's pretty much like a Wikipedia for genealogy. So if you know where your ancestor lived, you can go on there and see what records are available for that area. So if you are looking for your ancestor that lived in Louisiana, you can go on the Research Wiki, you can see what different records there are online for Louisiana, and you can start researching them that way. Because I feel, this is if you have an ancestor that has no no stories written about them, right? If you have no information, really, that's how you would need to start to get information. Um, Also, newspapers are a great resource for finding little bits of their story. So newspapers back 100, 200 years ago, that was like their social media of the day. Like they wrote the comings and goings of people, when people got married, when they had children, and people are engaged, just all kinds of little tidbits about their life that you can't find in a record. I have an ancestor that there was a newspaper article written about her that provided glimpses into who she was, that talked about how she let teenagers come into her home and she'd feed a lot of the homeless children in the area, like different things that I would not get that from a death record, right?
Right.
So newspapers are a great place to look for kind of more of the fun parts of their life, more of the interesting details. And then also census records. I love census records because they're very easy, well, relatively easy to find. After 1850 in the United States, that they listed all of the names in the household. They listed their occupation. Some census records even tell how much they made that year. You can have their address, which then you could look up on Google Maps and see if their home is still standing. Like there's so much you can find just from a census record that can give you a lot of glimpses into your family's life, which then will help you to write their story. So those are some of the things that I would use.
Those are three of my favorites. I love the Wiki. It's super helpful. And newspapers. I'm so partial to newspapers. I love that they're not only it's ridiculous. Like, Heather was going to Megan's house for the weekend.
Right. I know.
But you do get great information from them.
Mm-hmm.
So just great tools. Those were good examples.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of an interesting one. I'm curious how people are going to answer this. So when it comes to writing a story, how do you balance, and what is your thought on the balancing accuracy of the story versus the need to tell a compelling story? So like facts versus, loose facts of the story.
I know. My grandpa always said, like, don't let too many truths get in the way of good story. So
that's great.
Yeah, I do feel like as a genealogist, I gotta go with truth. Like there's just, and I feel like, yes, there's a good story with kind of stretching things a bit or whatever, but I feel like true connection to our ancestors, that comes with honesty and really truth and understanding their story. And really, what's the purpose of it, right? We want to, at least I want to have a true recollection of my ancestors' lives. So even if it's not quite as exciting to read about an ancestor who was a farmer and, maybe lived a pretty mellow life, but that's who they were, like that's what their life was like. So, and I feel like even those people that seem maybe boring in their life, we can tie in different aspects to make their story more interesting. Maybe we can look at what was going on in the area at the time and think, how would that have affected them? What would it might have been like for them? Maybe we don't know exactly how they would have felt that their oldest son died in World War II, but what do we think they might have felt like? And so we might not have all of the hard facts about their lives, but I think we can include maybe our perspective of what it might have been like for them. And we can use that verbiage even as we write their story, that might make it a little more interesting.
Yeah, I'm always an advocate for the historical and social context of the time. I think that adds so much to help us understand their perspective so much better. Fun questions. I'm excited about these. So can you share a particularly memorable experience you've had while researching a family story, or share your favorite story?
Yeah, so a lot of my family history is very well researched already. Like I have lots of aunts and uncles and my dad, they've all done a lot of research. So a lot of the things that I've learned about my own ancestors is things that other people have found, but I can still learn and enjoy that kind of process of uncovering what I find there. And one of the stories is just a story about my great grandfather. It's not really even a story, but just knowing about his life. So he and his wife, they had 7 children, and his 7th child died shortly after birth, and his wife also died shortly after that. She got an infection in the hospital and she died. So he was left with 6 young children. My grandfather was only 4 years old. He was the youngest at the time. And at her funeral, they were all sitting around the table, and my grandfather's grandfather, so his mother's father, was there, and he said, "Hey, Earl, how would you like to be my little boy?" And so my grandfather went and lived with his grandfather, stayed here in Alberta. His father and all his other siblings, they moved to Calgary. He remarried, and then they eventually moved back down to Utah. So my grandfather wasn't raised with his father or his other siblings. And I think, like, I sometimes wonder why, like, that seems a little hard, but I can see that raising, a young child as a father with,
Yeah.
5 other children that need him, and then newly remarried and all of that, the stress was probably a lot. But my grandfather, he still was connected to them. He still kept in touch with them. I didn't even really know about that until a few years ago, kind of what the process was, because we had large family reunions with this family still. His father, Berg, he went on to, he remarried and then had another 6 children, I think it was, or 7. And so they had a large family. We'd have family reunions with them every 3 years. So it didn't even seem like he wasn't a part of the family. He was still. So I think just knowing that story kind of has helped me know that when there's hard things that happen, like my great grandfather, Berg Ellingson, we have pictures of him and he just has a huge smile. Even though his wife passed away and his son, like, he went on to live his life and keep going. And so I don't know why, like, it's not really a very memorable story, but I think just when I connect his picture to his story, it kind of has always stuck with me as kind of a strength in my life. So that's one story. And I have another great grandfather, I think he is. He is from Norway, and he left home quite young because his father was abusive physically, and he went and worked on a ship and traveled around Europe. His mother died while he was away, and as he was on a ship one night, he could, like, feel his mother's presence, and he knew that she had passed on. He eventually came to Canada. He became he was a painter by trade and painted railway cars in New Brunswick. And we have a picture of him doing a handstand. Like, there's stories of him doing, like, backflips and things. So he just seems like quite the character. And I don't know, just learning his story, which is a little bit more unique than, like, my farmer ancestors that traveled across the plains or whatever. I just think he'd be a cool ancestor to meet someday.
Yes, I always have those thoughts. I'd love to meet them. What would you ask them? And
Right.
those were great stories. So was your grandfather, he was the youngest then when your grandmother passed? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Those were great stories. Thank you for sharing those. What are a few tips, tricks, pieces of advice, or wisdom you would leave with our audience for telling those stories?
Yeah. I would say to take it slow. I think a lot of times, at least for myself, when I'm like, okay, I'm going to go learn about someone, and it can get frustrating because it is often hard to find new information. So I would say to take it slow, and really just to think about what life was like for our ancestors. And for the records that we do find, maybe we only find, like, a baptism record or something, but we can see all of the clues that we can get from that one record. Always look at the image of a record, see who was the witnesses. Maybe they were related somehow, maybe they were good family friends. We can learn more about them. Even just looking at what our ancestors' occupation was, and then we can Google that. Like, a lot of the occupations are outdated names, so we can Google that and see what that occupation was and learn about what life was like for a person who did that occupation, right? just the other day, so the 1931 census just came out in Canada, and I was able to find my grandmother in there. She was only 11 years old, but her father, it said that he made only $200 that year. And he was out of work for 32 of the 52 weeks in the past year. And so just that one little glimpse, that one little piece of information, I'm like, okay, what was their life like? It was 1931, the start of the dirty 30s. He was out of work. He's a coal miner. Like, that was probably pretty rough. And so just looking at all the little pieces of information, don't just look at their name on a census record, but follow the line across, see what other details you can learn about them and how you can write that and add that into their story. So yeah, I'd say just take it slow and just understand that it's a process. It's not a race to build the biggest, most full tree. But I believe that as we learn, if we learn about those ancestors, that's how we truly connect to them.
I agree 100%. It's not a race,
Yeah.
definitely take your time. And that was the one record I didn't mention before, that it's amazing to me what you can find in a census. I think so many people are so focused on just those names and dates, and they don't look, at everything else that can paint, a bigger picture.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Megan, I thank you for your passion and your expertise that you share with the field. I feel honored that I got to spend time with you today, and I
thank you so
appreciate
much.
you being on here with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your time today. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Family Treehouse, where we celebrate the power of storytelling and preserving our family legacies. Storied is more than just a platform for sharing stories. Dive into those historical records and newspapers, discovering the hidden gems that bring your ancestors to life. Add branches to your family tree, connecting the dots between generations. Thank you for joining us on this storytelling journey. Your stories matter, and through Storied, they have the power to resonate across time and touch the hearts of generations to come. Keep uncovering your family's history and keep the spirit of storytelling alive with Storied.